Hi there, and welcome to MidDay Café, our special Microsoft Viva Glint edition. And I am your host, Michael Gannotti, along with co-host
Tyrelle Barnes.
And we are very excited to talk to you today about Microsoft Viva Glint. We have a phenomenal special guest that Tyrelle lined up. And I got to tell you, listening to those two in the beginning, I was basically starstruck and kind of dumbfounded. I was like, wow, it's awesome stuff. But Tyrelle, I mean, you have been in the thick of all things Glint and analysis. Really, your statistician background readily, I mean, I'm sure you eat all this up. And so why don't you tell us a little bit, before we jump into our interview, tell us a bit about Glint, Viva Glint, and how orgs can leverage it, some of the things we're doing here, and then we'll get into that interview, but because you have so much to add here.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Yeah, well, at Microsoft, we're so fortunate because we are super data driven. We are able to capture so much rich signal and collaboration data from the graph. And so our, approach to employee experience is built on data. And we're really lucky to have the people science team from Glint join us and helping do a lot of this research, and they are fully into the Microsoft platform now that we've brought them over from LinkedIn. And so Viva Glint is an engagement survey platform, and we have there's some differentiators with it. First of all, we built the taxonomy for Viva Glint in partnership with Stanford University. So we're able to use the least number of questions, research-based questions, to get employee feedback. So it's a delightful experience for the employees, and it results in an over 80% on average response rates. So that's one thing that's different about it. The other thing is the people science team did, and we're going to hear from one of the leaders shortly. They did a study in 2022. And so they looked at 226 organizations, 3 million employees, and these are all publicly traded on the US stock exchanges. And over that period of January to December 2022, we saw that the correlation between employee engagement scores at those companies and their performance in the S&P 500. And they actually, for the highest engaged employee organizations, outperformed the S&P 500 over that 12-month period. And that was a bear market. And so those business outcomes, how tightly employee engagement is tied to business outcomes and performance, is huge. I mean, it can't be a nice to have anymore. So I just wanted to share that because that was just really powerful. And I think we've known that at Microsoft for quite a while. But now to be able to share, this technology and these solutions and all of this rich research that goes with it, and leverage AI across the graph and all of these things is just really a pleasure. So that's that's my intro.
Love it. So I mean, I don't want to waste any more time. So we have a very, very special guest. It was exciting, and like I said, I sat there literally dumbfounded, like, this is awesome just listening, because light bulbs were going off in my head. And I've been presenting Glint for a while, and it was just great to get, this gentleman's perspective. So do you want to introduce, and then we'll kick on over to the interview?
Yes, Head of Talent, Justin Bethke, is our special guest. And just can't wait for you to hear from him. Hi, Justin, how are you doing?
Doing well yourself?
Good, thanks. Thanks for joining us today. So you're the head of People Science Advisory here at Microsoft now, and I know you came from the LinkedIn team,
yes,
and specifically from Glint. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about that? Like, what is Glint, first of all, and what does that mean now that Glint has moved to Microsoft and is now Viva Glint? Let's start with that.
Yeah, happy to share. So a little bit about myself first. I am an industrial organizational psychologist by background. That's, a mouthful, but really it's the study of humans at work. So something near and dear to all of our hearts in terms of where we spend most of our time throughout our lives. And really the idea of trying to make things, drew me to Glint in the first place, how can the study of what people do at work make work a better experience for people? And so that's kind of been what my career is centered on. Luckily, I found myself at Glint. I've been a internal practitioner in this kind of space for a long time, doing employee opinion surveys, collecting data, assessments, all the kind of fun, nerdy things that put a metric to how people feel about what their job is like and the kind of happiness it creates in their lives. And so I was fortunate enough to join Glint right when it was being acquired by LinkedIn. So Glint has been around for a number of years and was kind of a fast-growing startup in the space. And LinkedIn actually acquired Glint when they were looking for somebody to do their own employee listening adventure when they were getting acquired by Microsoft. And so LinkedIn purchased Glint. They liked us so much. The bad joke is they bought us when they started working with us. And I've been on that team since it was part of LinkedIn, and now we had a great run with LinkedIn, built some amazing integrations with other LinkedIn products like LinkedIn Learning. But then, Microsoft went and introduced Microsoft Viva, and it turns out when you're setting up the employee experience space, a pretty critical part of that is how you measure and understand the employee experience. And that's where Glint is. So at its core, gives you the ability to understand how people feel about their work environment. Our mission is to make people happier and more successful at work. So think, there's all these things that are happening to me in the work environment, the surveys, the places I get a chance to give feedback to make my work environment better are my chance to make myself happier and ultimately make the company more successful.
Awesome. Very cool. And I've gotten the pleasure of being in some meetings with you and hearing you engage with customers, and it's just fascinating. It's such a great discipline and such a needed and I guess addition to the Viva space and to our knowledge base here at Microsoft. So welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks. Officially, about a month and a half in as a Microsoft, different blue badge, LinkedIn blue badge, now a Microsoft blue badge.
Great. Well, so what are some of the trends that you're seeing in the space today with customers and your conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an ever-changing space. I mean, I think, the study of doing surveys kind of started back in the 1990s and early research around engagement. It was pretty static for a long time. The world of COVID, the world of the great reshuffle, great resignation after COVID, hybrid work, all of those things have driven some pretty massive changes in the space. One thing you'll hear frequently in this space is just frequency. Like, what's the right cadence for me to measure how employees feel? And of course, the bad consultant background I maybe have is that depends. There is no one right answer for every company, but the days of doing a survey once every couple years and doing nothing, no other efforts to understand the employee experience, I think it's pretty clear that the world can change pretty quickly. And what's important to employees in some cases has stayed relatively stable. People still want to have an opportunity to grow and be successful in their jobs. But other things do change, and they can change pretty rapidly. So things like creating a sense of belonging in your organization. 5 years ago, that was outside the top 5 in terms of things that were most important to kind of the global employee experience. Now it's within the top 3 across all of our customer base. So that creating a sense of belonging, if you're not keeping tabs on how important that is to your employees, you might be missing a driver there that really keeps people engaged and happy and staying with your organization. Honestly, I think one of the biggest shifts we're seeing then is, what does that frequency look like? And is it, I survey everybody once a day? Do I do the smile sheets? Do I do NPS? Like, what's the right cadence for me? And like I said, there's no one right answer, but where we're seeing a trend is more towards, what are the business outcomes you're trying to drive? So less about saying, we're going to set a cadence of this and it's going to look like this for the next 5 years, but what are the business outcomes you're trying to drive? If you're an organization that has a once-a-year survey, but maybe you're a manufacturing organization and have a bunch of less than 90-day churn, then you should probably do some onboarding surveys to try and diagnose what the exact business problem you're trying to solve there is lower attrition within the first 90 days. And I think a big kind of sin of this space has been, well, then you just keep adding them. And pretty soon, you get to a vision where you've got 100 dashboards with 1 million different surveys and nobody's taking action on them. And so that's really the kind of reset it went through. For a long time, it's just more and more and more surveys. And now we're seeing kind of that correction back to like, what is the problem you're trying to solve and where can you take action? And that should be kind of the central piece to how what's the right cadence you listen to your employees on. And I'll talk a little bit about passive and active in a moment here, but that's where we're seeing some of those trends change to the point of like, hey, we solved that problem. Maybe we don't need to have a survey that's hitting everyone every day at that moment in time, and we can actually turn that survey moment off.
Yeah, I love that. And my background as a statistician is making me think about that application to like looking at people as assets. And going from like a time-based, what we call for an asset, time-based maintenance approach to a outcome-based maintenance approach, and what's the outcome you're trying to achieve, and then backtrack from there on how do you instrument and then gather the signal. So fascinating.
Yeah, and
Well,
as much
cool.
as much as things have changed, I mean, there's also things that haven't changed. We're constantly doing ROI analysis. Like we're trying to get away from the days of there's this survey thing, it's an HR-driven process. Managers do it because it's kind of a check the box activity. That's kind of the age-old survey kind of stigma that we try and break. More towards like we can still prove even through the last 2 years with everything that's changed in the macro environment and the way companies operate, those companies that are doing this well and driving, an engaged workforce or a happy workforce or a thriving workforce, like we talk about at Microsoft, have significantly different business outcome results. So think like share price, think retention, think customer satisfaction. With all the change that's happened within the industry, the one thing that hasn't changed is like, yeah, it still turns out it's still a pretty good idea to have people that are happy in their jobs and want to continue working there. And just doing the active, continuing to listen and ask and drive feedback is a big driver within that.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And I share that. I think your team did the survey and the study that we did in 2022 from January to December, looking at employee engagement correlated with their stock performance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and just fascinating how related it is, how performance is so related to engagement and productivity. So
Yeah.
that new equation we're talking about with high performing organizations. So what other kind of data sets or other products or synergies do you see where this is going in the space? Because I know there's a kind of a trend towards capturing like behavioral data as well and taking that and pairing it with the sentiment data.
Yeah, I mean, it goes by many names, but we sometimes talk about active and passive data. So kind of talking about what each of those are. Active meaning I'm asking you for something. It's a survey. It's some type of moment where you're giving me something because I'm asking you. That's active data collection. Passive data collection is the things we just get to see. So think how many meetings are happening within your finance department, how many emails are being sent by a group of people. Those are what we call passive signals. Also a fun term, digital exhaust, is a term I've found in this space for that, which is kind of fun. And I think each of those has an incredible amount of value. The passive signals is relatively new. That's not something that we had to make decisions off of 10 years ago, but there's a ton of value there. And where we're seeing the kind of 1 + 1 = 3 is when you combine that active and passive data together. So we're in private preview with some of this combination between Viva Glint and Viva Insights right now, but that idea that we can say, let's look at, for example, through organizational network analysis, we can tell what the average network size is of a group of people. And you may look at that as good or bad. Like, is it good to have a small network and it's really close relationships? Is it bad to have a small network because you're not as connected? When you pair that with the active collection, survey data, you can actually say, well, do people with smaller networks feel less sense of belonging in the organization? Because then it is something we need to take action on versus something that might just be interesting. And so we like to think about it when we're talking to customers as you've got a lens that you can look through that's the active data, a lens that you can look through that's the passive data. When you stack those lenses together, you can get some pretty compelling insights, and all with the understanding of how can we drive more surgical action. So, another example a real world example we're talking to customers about right now is just because you have, departments that might be working a lot more hours after their typical shift would end, or you set the parameters of what outside of work looks like. That doesn't mean the experience is spread like peanut butter and everybody who's working outside hours feels, terrible about it. In fact, some people might feel great about it. That creates a better sense of balance for them in their specific setup. But when you again stack on the how many people are working too many hours outside of work and how do they feel about their sense of well-being, you can then get that really kind of surgical look at, okay, we're finding a department or a level in the organization, or, most recent finding was around frontline managers, where they're not putting as many hours in after hours as like VPs in this specific organization, but when it comes to how they feel about their time, they feel significantly worse about their sense of well-being, in part because of all of those, the additional kind of time they might be spending out off the clock, so to speak.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how it's much more powerful when you have that kind of context and related to. So how should our account teams and our customers get started? Like, what's the best place? Like, if they, maybe they are kind of old school and have a survey once a year or once every couple years, what's a way for them to transition and transform to a newer approach?
It's a great question, and this is where we spend a lot of our time. And I, in my career, have led survey programs for very large organizations. It is not a simple flip of the switch to say like, hey, we do it once every other year. Now we're just going to do it monthly. We're just going to make that change. It is a daunting task. If you think about the things that hit every single employee, there aren't actually that many in an organization that literally hit CEO to frontline worker, for example, but surveys are one of them. So if you think about the level of visibility of a survey program, in a lot of cases, it might be one of the very few things that every single person in the organization, top to bottom, experiences. That said, there's ways that we can kind of step into that. So, for example, like I mentioned, different life cycle surveys. We're not going to come to you, we're not seeing success where we're just saying we think quarterly is the right answer, so we're just going to snap to that. Business outcomes being a big driver of that. Other cadences. So think about like other moments in the talent cycle. If we went from an annual review process to a quarterly review process or quarterly talent review, wouldn't it be great if we had quarterly insights from our employees around where there's attrition risk or where we feel like there's a gap in terms of people feeling like they can grow and develop? And so being really intentional about not just picking a cadence, but picking a cadence that matches up to either another business rhythm or an HR kind of talent rhythm. And the other piece is we don't have to start with the full big census survey. Like that's the big anchor moment of most listening surveys or strategies. Sometimes it's best not to actually start there. Let's actually start with a pulse survey of a department that might be going through a massive reorg and use that as our first attempt to try and get a little bit more, frequent data versus saying we're going to change the kind of big behemoth top to bottom survey moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think we've gotten a lot of great wisdom and advice from you today. I really appreciate it.
I got a couple of questions as well,
please.
Justin. As I'm listening to you, and the idea around really being intentional about the surveys, right? So they're not just, like you said, it's not the annual or biannual, but it's also not, hey, more is better, because we want them to be actionable, right? So you're gaining insight you can take action on. Where do you see as organizations, if they're embarking on a path of really starting to get that sentiment analysis from their employees, where does that typically start in an org, and who are the players and things they should consider?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is the age-old battle of like, where is it owned versus who's accountable to drive it? Yeah. And so sometimes that's hard to tease out, because if it's typically these are HR-driven processes, the budget, the center of expertise that drives it might be in talent management or people analytics or something like that. Where we see it successful, though, is like action taking at the lowest level possible. So if you're an organization and, where we see action happening at the low level, so we're giving frontline managers who have, minimum N size of 5, let's just say for sake of conversation, where we're getting them the results, we're actually seeing the biggest difference in terms of, looking at differences in behavior as observed by those surveys. We see it at that local level more than the traditional kind of, okay, I'm a VP, I've got 500 people underneath me, my action plan for all 500 people is going to look like this. That's where we tend to not be as successful in this space. So localizing and allowing for the nuances of subcultures within teams is one of the most common places. Like we can push that accountabilities to say, even though the centralized program might be owned by HR, this isn't an HR thing, manager. Like this is your team, this is your data. You're empowered to take action and drive your own results.
When you said that, and it's like, bing, light bulb went off, and I'd never thought of this before. When we were going, with the pandemic, we've had people surveys and stuff forever, but I remember for the first time we started assigning, and I was one of the people for 1 year, right? But we would take it was the big survey, but then they were pushing down the results, not only to, like you're saying, down to the frontline managers, like, you got accountability around this, right? And what's happening, but it even went to the, in a sense, like, we reviewed them as the people person. We reviewed them with our peers, and then we discussed them with and it became so collaborative. And even though, results were anonymous and all that kind of stuff, and we were reviewing also the higher ones, the kind of conversation and discourse that it spawned, and also the change in actions. And I can say definitively, I had a manager who, they had a lot of tension originally, I think, with some of the employees, and there was some of that came out and turned it around completely. They had the best of intentions to begin with, but it really highlighted for them things that spawned the broader conversations that fed back into how do we work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's stories like that make the space so interesting and keep so many people interested in it. And the reason why products exist to solve it is, I think one of the things we often talk about, extremely focused, and we see it as one of the top drivers across industries around being and having an inclusive environment and feeling a sense of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
One of the unique ways we see surveys play a role in that is, it's like the great equalizer of voices. The CEO, Satya, he counts as one N size in the employee survey results. The same weight is given to his one response as is anyone in the organization. And so if you're that person who sits on a team who doesn't feel like your voice is heard, or doesn't feel like you get equal playtime, or maybe people aren't paying it, you don't feel included, that's one of the values of that survey data, is it just forces that everybody's voice counts the same. And that's personally why I think the space has such a kind of noble cause to create more inclusive environments and happier and successful employees. And that kind of equalizer that you talked about, it's not just like, hey, I'm only listening to the squeaky wheel. Now I've got a full view of what my whole team thinks, and nobody's voice counts more than the other person. I think we've seen that change as we've pushed those results lower into organizations.
Yeah, and I really like what you said, that idea of, maybe HR owns this top portion, but it's really pushing the ownership of the output down to where it belongs. Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah.
And so one quick thing, if we think about where this is headed, the biggest kind of fault or flaw is still getting to that point of taking action. And so we've started to see where there are, everybody wants to talk about AI, so we'll talk about what in our space, what does that mean? And there's some really, we can nerd out on that for a long time, ideas of how this can be helpful. But I think the most compelling is, you are that leader that has the voice of your employees. Maybe it's the combination of passive and active data. Maybe it's just you're sitting on a data set of 2,000 comments. And there's a value in reading comments. I feel like I've spent most of my life reading employee comments in this space. It's a labor of love, and it's not always efficient. And so the exciting thing that we were able to start to showcase now and start to get into private previews of with our customers is the ability for Microsoft Copilot, our AI engine, to actually help you avoid that pitfall, which is, I've got all the data, I've got all of these voices. How do I go from that overwhelming moment into what next step I can see? And so examples of summarizing written comments in a way where you can kind of ping back and forth questions to say, what are my people in this region saying about work-life balance? And instead of just reading comments over and over again, getting those narrative statements generated by AI. Or I've got all these data points. How do I want to share the results out to the team? So seeing AI generate a post that you could put on a site like Engage, where you could actually say, these are the things we found from our most recent survey, and helping that step where there's still a reliance on the person being motivated enough and not scared. Like Michael, you said earlier, like some of the resistance to, how is this gonna go? Am I gonna be comfortable as I walk through this? Leveraging AI as an assistant to get over that hurdle in this space, I think, is a fascinating use case, and one we're all super excited about.
That's
awesome.
that's tremendous. I love all the co-pilot stories, It's really a game changer.
It is.
Well, anything else, Mike?
No, I'm good. I mean, I thought this was great. That really was a light bulb moment for me. I can now speak better to my customers because we do get asked that, right? And a lot of orgs are struggling, where should this live? Who drives? And there's ownership because you have budget and other things, but and maybe some of the expertise, like you're saying, around how do we craft, what are we asking, right? You got to ask the right questions to get the answers, that are actionable in a way that's meaningful, but really pushing it down. I thought that for me was, we're sitting here.
Great.
I know I've heard we have a high response rate at Microsoft, our employee surveys, because we know that our leadership does action on the listening and what comes out of them. So
yeah, it's hard. We often get that challenge of like, well, what's the right response rate? And it's kind of the chicken and egg conversation, because it's way easier to drive people taking the survey when they believe action's going to be taken from it. If you're not seeing that, it's really hard to drive participation, because it's that, is this worth my time? Nobody's going to come back and check in with me. I'm not going to see my later take action. So back to that, what another thing that hasn't changed in the space is how you take, it's not just collecting the data and, asking the right questions is critically important. But if we're not following up with, this is how we're actually making your subculture and your team or your work environment better, then that's where we start to lose steam in those efforts.
This is so fascinating and important, and it applies to all of us. I could just spend hours asking you questions about it. But thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us today and help educate our customers and ourselves on this space. So
yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a great time, and I'm happy to come back and talk more anytime about this stuff.
Great. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, that was great, Mike. It's all about building a feedback culture to help organizations really understand and improve employee engagement to drive business outcomes. And I could listen to Justin. I mean, it's fascinating. People science is just fascinating.
As you two were going, I was like, we could go an hour, 2 hours easy on just this.
We might need to do a follow-up with him in a few months and do a check-in, see what's the latest and greatest with Copilot.
Yeah, and maybe an even more in-depth session, because I think that'd be great. Well, I'm excited. I know, just to let our viewers or listeners out there know, we're going to be moving to an every other week cadence. But for today's session, there was so much packed in that, and I know a lot of folks are going to want follow-up. First thing is, remember, talk to your Microsoft account team. They are ready and willing to bring in folks like Tyrelle, myself, all kinds of folks who are ready to help you, not only with Glint, but with your overall employee experience. We want to help. We want you to be successful. That's number one. Number two, as a part of this, at our blog at aka.ms/HLS-blog, it's aka.ms/HLS-blog. This post will be in its full entirety, not just the audio clip or video clip, but the video along with resources underneath. So we'll be including links to Glint, about Viva Glint, about Viva overall, around adoption and strategies to aid in adoption and to maximize your investments. A whole wealth of content will be there as well. So make sure you go there and grab that. And then we'll see you in 2 weeks. And in the interim, both Tyrelle and I have a couple of little things we'll be doing. So Tyrelle, real quick, what are you doing?
I'll be riding my bike in Italy, some of the big alpine climbs, Stelvio, Gavia. So wish me luck. And please share the road, everybody.
And share the road. Yeah, that's a good one. That's important. And I'll be heading off. I'm going to be, while you're climbing up mountains, I'm going to be diving under the water and doing some scuba diving in the Caribbean. So
fun.
You'll see the hawks and eagles and the clouds, and I'll be looking hopefully at sharks and other fun sea critters.
Sea turtles.
Sea turtles, yes, I do enjoy them.
Take some pictures.
There'll be lots of pictures. You too. So with that, this is Mike.
This is Tyrelle.
Bidding you all have a great day from MidDay Café. Keep the caffeine coming, and we'll see you on the flip side. Bye now.
Bye.